In the aftermath of a losing battle, regardless of how aggressively a lobster has behaved, it becomes unwilling to fight further, even against another previously defeated opponent.
Philosophers are, first and foremost, normal human beings, just like you and I. The ideas they write down in books are sometimes a response to political conditions unfolding in their own era. They're sometimes a response to personal problems in their private lives. And sometimes historically, we know what those problems were, and sometimes they weren't recorded for history. And often, all too often, philosophers are people who get excited about new ideas emerging from the sciences. They take little fragments of information from the sciences and they get inspired and just kind of run with it, kind of make up a bunch of new stuff. One of the most extreme examples of this is Descartes. So if you're not a fan of René Descartes, you might at least recognize the adjective form of his name, Cartesian. You have to be very famous in philosophy to have your name used as an adjective. In any case, Descartes, he saw some black and white diagrams of the structure of the brain, and he just got massively inspired by what he saw as literally the central organ of the brain, the pineal gland, which is also pronounced the pineal gland, whatever. He just had no idea what this thing did, its biological function, its structural significance, its role in cognition or anything else. He had absolutely no idea. But the guy saw some diagrams, he got some ideas, and he ended up creating what we could frankly call like a new religion, a totally fictitious bunch of biological and psychological claims about the brain. He heard about some new discoveries in the sciences, and he just took those ideas and ran with them. In that sense, philosophy sometimes more resembles the creative arts, or it even resembles science fiction. I think people have really overlooked the extent to which the philosophy of mind presented by Dr. Jordan Peterson, likewise, is his response to some little fragments of scientific knowledge that he read about lobsters, about crayfish. He read them, he didn't really understand them, and then he got inspired and made a whole bunch of things up. And he made those things up, he came up with those ideas, I think, transparently, in response to personal problems he was struggling with, and partly, yes, in response to political and social preoccupations that we see throughout his writing.
A vanquished competitor loses confidence, sometimes for days. Sometimes the defeat can have even more severe consequences. If a dominant lobster is badly defeated, its brain basically dissolves. Then it grows a new subordinate's brain, one more appropriate to its new lowly position. Its original brain just isn't sophisticated enough to manage the transformation from king to bottom dog without virtually complete dissolution and regrowth. Anyone who has experienced a painful transformation after a serious defeat in romance or career may feel some sense of kinship with the once successful crustacean. One citation for a whole lot of statements of fact. Well, let's look at reference 8. Side note, I am getting incredibly lucky on finding the PDFs for these things online. The quick version is, I don't know where Peterson got some of the ideas he talks about because it sure as shit isn't in this paper. After reading Its Brain Basically Dissolves, I came into this paper expecting some magical butterfly transformation here. Crustaceans aren't really far removed from other creepy crawlies, so maybe it's able to somehow just dissolve its brain? This paper says nothing about brains dissolving. This section begins with a discussion of reference 9. You only know this if you actually have reference 9 in front of you because Peterson's reference placement is practically random. Anyways, basically, lobster doms have more serotonin pumping through them. From reference 8, you win, you get a higher level of serotonin. If you're a submissive lobster, you have a higher ratio of octopamine to serotonin. But if you give lobster subs more serotonin, they start acting dommy. Then, if you give lobsters Prozac, the effects of the serotonin shot are reduced. So in this experiment, giving the lobsters Prozac kept the serotonin out in the goo, basically, and not in the tissues. And why the fuck is Peterson talking about this? He says that Prozac has much the same chemical and behavioral effect in depressed people. Is Prozac a performance-enhancing drug? I hadn't realized. Is that on their warnings for the drug commercial?
So we've already established that Dr. Jordan Peterson is fundamentally the same as René Descartes, in that he's a non-specialist who stumbled upon some scientific anecdotes in another field. He got inspired, and as we say in English, he ran with it. He started making up new ideas in response to this inspiration. It remains for us to question why. Why was he so inspired by this? Why did it matter so much to him? Now, in the case of René Descartes, there's an explanation. You can look at what were his religious and psychological assumptions. What was it he was looking for, consciously or unconsciously, that made him respond so dramatically to this diagram of the brain and think, yes, that's it. You can put the pieces together, okay? He had an idea about the soul being immaterial, and there must be a gateway between the body and the soul somewhere in the brain. He had an agenda, and he took some bits and pieces of science to suit his agenda. That's exactly what happened with Dr. Jordan Peterson when he stumbled upon this anecdote about lobsters and crayfish. Okay? He had no sincere interest in the details of these scientific studies. The point's already been made. I quoted another YouTube channel there, Cass Aris. The point has already been made that if you were to take his scientific claims seriously, they would be irresponsible and false. I would go further. I wouldn't just say it's invalid. I'd say it's somewhat surreal and dreamlike. I think Jordan Peterson responded to these scientific sources in the same way some people respond to poetry or a quotation from the Buddha or something. He just treated this like a literary trope. He got all worked up about it, and then he ran with it. And he ran and ran and ran. This is a huge deal to him. Okay, why? What does it mean to him? Well, the idea that unequal levels of serotonin in the brain correspond to your dominance in society. The idea that serotonin has like a dollar value in the economy of social inequality. That's a very, very powerful symbol for him. It links his political philosophy to his psychological philosophy, okay? And it also links his public message of improve your posture, stand up with your back straight, be a dominant person all the time. It links that to his own family's private, tragic struggle in a very emotionally powerful way. Until quite recently, until just a few months ago, Jordan Peterson lived with the delusion that his daughter had a form of hereditary depression, that she had inherited depression from him. No scientific basis for that belief. He convinced himself, and he felt guilty about the notion that he had a mysterious autoimmune disease that made him depressed, an autoimmune disease with depression as a symptom, and that his daughter had also inherited this disease. Now, the symptoms were real. And it didn't take a genius to write in and say, hey, you know what? Your symptoms sound a lot like Lyme disease. This is one of the fans of Mikhaila Peterson, wrote and said, hey, Jordan Peterson's symptoms sound a lot like Lyme disease, and yours do too. So yeah, it was always possible for people to guess that, early onset arthritis, having arthritis when you're still a child, that sounds like Lyme disease. What Mikhaila Peterson actually had was Lyme disease, and then she had a whole long list of side effects from the irrelevant drugs that she was taking because her Lyme disease went undiagnosed, or you might say was misdiagnosed. Okay? So that's a real tragedy. I'm not ridiculing him for that. I'm not ridiculing his daughter for that. It's a tremendous tragedy that they had this disease in the family. It was not correctly diagnosed. It went untreated. And then they interpreted the symptoms of that illness as if it were a hereditary, mysterious, undiagnosed illness that Dr. Jordan Peterson was responsible for himself. Okay? So you have Peterson developing dependence, chemical dependence on antidepressants, SSRI, antidepressant drugs, and coming up with a justification for that. You have Dr. Peterson's daughter developing dependence on SSRI, antidepressants, and coming up with a justification for that. Okay? You have a whole family making excuses and trying to philosophize about their tragic, private struggle to get along in society, to compete, to be part of that dominance hierarchy, when they have, quote unquote, a serotonin deficit. Now, what Peterson did here is based on a very cursory reading, even of the research into the significance of serotonin for lobsters. What he's saying is really false, even about lobsters. It's also false as it is applied to human beings. It'd be a long video if we got into the details. Okay? Peterson never took a sincere interest in what the chemical effects of SSRI drugs are. He seems to know much less about it than I do. I'm not a specialist in the field, so that's really saying something. Okay? What Peterson was interested in was a justification for his own sense of inferiority as someone who he considered himself to have been born with low serotonin, with a serotonin deficit. So you can see he claims here that what he claims is that Prozac has the same effect on humans as it has on these lobsters in this particular study. And both are false. That's not the effect Prozac has on humans, as even Cass makes fun of him. She makes some jokes that this doesn't make sense. This is not what Prozac does to people. It also actually doesn't make sense with what the studies are saying about lobsters. 3 different species of crustacean are dealt with. It's a little bit complicated what those studies actually mean. There's no sincere interest in the science on either side of the equation. What there is a profound commitment to self-justification in dealing with his own sense of inadequacy as a relentless social climber and as someone who has this conservative, competitive view of society as a bunch of dominance hierarchies. And also for him dealing with his sense of guilt when he looks at his daughter, chronically sick, on a long list of medications, barely able to get out of bed, all these horrible side effects, right? And he feels, looking at that it's all his fault. So we have a misdiagnosed illness. Jordan imagines his family has hereditary depression. Jordan invents a philosophy that justifies his family's reliance on SSRI drugs. Thus the lobsters, thus the theory of serotonin levels as the currency in the economy of dominance. And then, plot twist, his daughter is diagnosed with Lyme disease. That's what explains the symptoms. She had it all along.